The musket ball whistled past Major George Washington's ear as he crouched behind a fallen oak tree, the acrid smoke of gunpowder thick in the Pennsylvania wilderness. It was July 9th, 1755, and the young Virginia militia officer had just witnessed one of the most devastating defeats in British military history. Around him, the remnants of General Edward Braddock's expedition lay scattered like broken dolls across the forest floor, their bright red uniforms now stained crimson with blood that was not from enemy fire alone. The French and Indian War had begun not with the grand declarations of European monarchs, but with a simple question: who would control the vast wilderness beyond the 13 colonies? Washington, barely 23 years old, had already tasted the bitter fruit of this conflict the previous year, when his hastily constructed Fort Necessity had fallen to French forces. Now, as he helped the mortally wounded Braddock retreat from the catastrophic Battle of the Monongahela, he could not have imagined that this wilderness war would ultimately reshape the fate of nations. The conflict had deeper roots than most colonists understood. Since the late 17th century, French explorers and traders had established a network of forts and trading posts stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, creating what they called New France, this vast territory threatened to encircle the British colonies, trapping them between the Atlantic Ocean and French-controlled lands. The Ohio River Valley, rich in fur-bearing animals and fertile soil, became the flashpoint where these two imperial powers would clash. British colonial merchants, particularly those in Virginia and Pennsylvania, viewed French expansion as a direct threat to their economic interests. The Ohio Company, in which Washington's family held shares, had been granted 200,000 acres in the disputed territory. When French forces began constructing Fort Duquesne at the strategic confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, the stage was set for confrontation. The war's early phases revealed critical weaknesses in British military strategy. European-trained officers like Braddock approached wilderness warfare with rigid tactical thinking, marching their troops in formation through dense forests where French forces and their Native American allies could strike from concealment. The disastrous defeat at the Monongahela, where Braddock's army of 2,000 regulars and militia was routed by fewer than 900 French and Indian warriors, demonstrated the futility of old-world military doctrine in New World conditions. Colonial forces, led by officers like Washington, proved more adaptable to frontier warfare. They learned to fight from cover, to move silently through forests, and to coordinate with friendly Native American tribes. These hard-won lessons would prove invaluable decades later when colonists would face British regulars in a very different kind of conflict. The French and Indian War served as a military academy for an entire generation of colonial officers who would later command continental forces against their former allies. The war also revealed the complex relationship between colonists and Native American tribes. While both French and British forces sought Indian allies, the French generally proved more successful in maintaining these relationships. French traders integrated more readily into Native American communities, often in adopting local customs. British colonists, driven by land hunger and agricultural expansion, posed a more direct threat to Native American territorial integrity. This fundamental difference in colonial approach would have lasting consequences for the continent's future. As Washington tended to the dying Braddock in the aftermath of the Monongahela disaster, the young officer began to understand that this war would transform not just the Ohio Valley, but the entire relationship between Britain and its North American colonies. The lessons learned in Pennsylvania's bloodied forests would echo through the halls of power in London and the meeting houses of colonial America, setting in motion events that would culminate in revolution. The French and Indian War was never merely a colonial conflict. It was North America's theater in what historians would later call the 7 Years' War, global struggle that engulfed Europe, the Caribbean, India, and the Philippines. As colonial militias skirmished in the Ohio Valley, European powers mobilized their vast resources for what would become history's first truly worldwide war. King Louis XV of France and King George II of Britain had transformed their colonial dispute into a contest for global supremacy. French forces in North America, though outnumbered nearly 20-1 by British colonists, possessed significant advantages: superior knowledge of wilderness terrain, stronger alliances with Native American tribes, and a unified command structure that could coordinate strategy across vast distances. The French also benefited from their more flexible approach to colonial administration, allowing local commanders greater autonomy in tactical decisions. British advantages lay in their superior naval power and the sheer demographic weight of their colonial populations. The 13 colonies contained approximately 1.5 million inhabitants, compared to perhaps 70,000 French colonists in all of New France. British manufacturing capacity also far exceeded French capabilities, providing a steady stream of weapons, ammunition, and supplies to colonial forces. However, these advantages meant little if British commanders could not effectively coordinate colonial military efforts. The war's turning point came with the arrival of new British leadership. William Pitt, the Elder, appointed as Secretary of State in 1757, revolutionized British strategy by treating the American conflict as the primary theater of operations rather than a sideshow to European campaigns. Pitt's approach involved massive financial investment in colonial forces. It's promising to reimburse colonial governments for military expenses and providing professional officers to train colonial militia. According to historical accounts documented in the Pennsylvania Gazette, Pitt's strategy transformed the war's trajectory through a series of coordinated campaigns designed to strangle French supply lines and isolate their North American colonies from metropolitan support. The British Royal Navy began systematically intercepting French supply ships, while colonial forces launched simultaneous attacks on French strongholds throughout the continent. The Siege of Louisbourg in 1758 marked the beginning of French collapse in North America. This fortress, controlling access to the St. Lawrence River and dubbed the Gibraltar of the North, fell to British forces after a costly but decisive siege. The victory opened the maritime approaches to Quebec, heart of French colonial power, demonstrated that British forces could successfully assault even the most heavily fortified French positions. Colonial participation in these campaigns provided invaluable military experience to thousands of Americans. Men like Benedict Arnold, Ethan Allen, and Israel Putnam learned siege warfare, coordinated military logistics, and experienced the challenges of maintaining discipline in extended campaigns. Perhaps more importantly, they witnessed British military organization firsthand, studying the strengths and weaknesses of European professional armies. The war also fostered unprecedented cooperation between previously disparate colonial governments. The Albany Congress of 1754, though ultimately unsuccessful in creating a unified colonial government, established precedents for intercolonial coordination that would prove crucial during the Revolutionary War. Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union, rejected by both colonial assemblies and the British Crown, contained ideas that would resurface in the Articles of Confederation and ultimately the Constitution. Native American alliances shifted dramatically as French power waned. Tribes that had long cooperated with French traders and officials found themselves increasingly isolated, forced to choose between accommodation with British colonists or continued resistance. The Iroquois Confederacy, the most powerful Native American political organization in the Northeast, gradually shifted from neutrality to cautious cooperation with British forces, a decision that would have profound consequences for their future relationships with both British and American governments. As French resistance crumbled throughout 1758 and 1759, colonial confidence grew proportionally. Americans who had once viewed themselves as subjects of a distant crown began to see themselves as partners in a great imperial enterprise. This psychological transformation, subtle but profound, would prove crucial in the decades following the war's conclusion. The autumn of 1759 would forever be remembered as the year of miracles for British arms in North America. As crimson and gold leaves fell across the Canadian landscape, so too did the final pillars of French colonial power. The Siege of Quebec, culminating in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, represented not merely a military victory but a complete Transformation of North American Geopolitics. General James Wolfe, barely 32 years old, had been chosen to lead the assault on Quebec despite his youth and relatively modest military experience. His opponent, the Marquis de Montcalm, was a seasoned veteran of European campaigns, who understood both the strategic importance of Quebec and the wiring possibility of holding it against a determined British siege. The city's position on the St. Lawrence River made it the gateway to all French territory in North America. Its fall would effectively end French colonial resistance. The siege began in June 1759, with a massive British fleet carrying nearly 9,000 troops up the St. Lawrence. Colonial forces, including rangers from New Hampshire and Connecticut, served as scouts and skirmishers, their wilderness skills proving invaluable in the rocky terrain surrounding Quebec. These colonial soldiers observed British siege techniques with keen interest, learning lessons about artillery placement, supply line management, and coordinated assault tactics that would serve them well in future conflicts. Wolfe's famous nighttime assault on the Plains of Abraham demonstrated the evolution of British military thinking since the Braddock disaster. Instead of rigid European formations, British forces employed flexible tactics adapted to North American conditions. Colonial troops, fighting alongside British regulars, showed remarkable discipline and effectiveness in the decisive battle. The death of both Wolfe and Montcalm in the engagement became the stuff of legend, but the strategic consequences were even more significant than the romantic mythology. The fall of Quebec effectively ended organized French resistance in North America, though scattered fighting continued for another year. Montreal's surrender in 1760 completed the conquest of New France, bringing under British control territory stretching from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico. This vast acquisition would create unexpected problems for British imperial administration, problems that would ultimately contribute to colonial rebellion. Colonial forces had played crucial roles in every major British victory. The capture of Fort Niagara, the reduction of Fort Duquesne, renamed Fort Pitt, and the successful siege of Montreal all involved significant colonial military participation. These campaigns provided practical military education to thousands of colonists, creating a generation of experienced officers and soldiers who understood both the potential and limitations of professional military organization. The war's conclusion also revealed important differences in British and colonial attitudes toward territorial expansion. British officials, concerned about costs and Native American relations, sought to limit colonial expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Colonial leaders, flush with victory and hungry for new lands, viewed the conquered territory as rightful spoils of war. This fundamental disagreement would poison British colonial relations in the coming decades. Native American tribes found themselves in an increasingly precarious position as French power collapsed. The Delaware, Shawnee, and other tribes had fought alongside French forces, hoping to preserve their territorial integrity against British colonial expansion. With French defeat, these tribes faced the choice between submission to British authority or continued resistance without European support. Many chose resistance, leading to conflicts like Pontiac's Rebellion that would further strain British colonial relationships. The psychological impact of victory proved as important as its material consequences. Colonists who had long viewed themselves as inhabitants of a remote frontier now saw themselves as partners in a great imperial triumph. Provincial newspapers celebrated colonial military contributions, fostering a sense of pride and accomplishment that would prove difficult to suppress. The Pennsylvania Gazette and other colonial publications emphasized American bravery and effectiveness in the recent campaigns, subtly suggesting that colonial military capabilities rivaled those of European professionals. Economic changes accompanying military victory also transformed colonial society. Military contracts had enriched colonial merchants and manufacturers, demonstrating American economic potential. The removal of French competition opened new territories for trade and settlement, creating opportunities for rapid colonial expansion. However, these same changes would soon create new tensions as British officials sought to regulate and tax the expanded colonial economy. The ink on the Treaty of Paris in 1763 was barely dry when the true costs of Britain's magnificent victory began to emerge. King George III and his ministers faced a staggering reality. The war had doubled Britain's national debt to over £130 million, requiring annual interest payments that exceeded the government's entire peacetime revenue. The conquered territories, meanwhile, demanded expensive administration and military protection, creating ongoing financial obligations that threatened to bankrupt the empire. Lord George Grenville, appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1763, confronted these fiscal realities with characteristic precision. His calculations revealed that maintaining 10,000 British troops in North America would cost approximately £350,000 annually, a sum that represented nearly half of Britain's total military budget. The logical solution, from a British perspective, seemed obvious. The colonies that benefited from imperial protection should contribute to its costs. Colonial leaders viewed these fiscal arguments with profound skepticism. They had contributed significantly to the war effort through provincial taxes, military service, and economic disruption. Virginia alone had raised over £200,000 for military expenses, while Massachusetts had provided troops for nearly every major campaign. The suggestion that they should now pay additional taxes to support a permanent British military presence struck many colonists as both unjust and dangerous. The proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III, revealed another dimension of post-war imperial policy that would prove equally controversial. Established a temporary boundary line along the Appalachian Mountains, forbidding colonial settlement west of the Divide without explicit royal permission. British officials justified this policy as necessary to prevent conflicts with Native American tribes and to maintain imperial control over territorial expansion. Colonial reaction to the proclamation line was immediate and hostile. Land speculators, like George Washington, who had invested heavily in Western territories, saw their investments threatened by arbitrary imperial decree. Ordinary colonists, particularly in Virginia and Pennsylvania, viewed Western expansion as a natural right, earned through wartime service and sacrifice. The proclamation seemed to deny colonists the fruits of their own military victory, reserving the conquered territories for imperial administration rather than colonial development. According to contemporary accounts published in the Boston Evening Post, the proclamation also revealed fundamental differences in British and colonial attitudes toward Native American relations. British officials, seeking to avoid costly Indian wars, preferred negotiated boundaries and regulated trade relationships. Colonial leaders, representing constituencies hungry for new lands, favored aggressive expansion policies that would open territories for immediate settlement and development. The implementation of new revenue measures began with the Sugar Act of 1764, which reduced duties on molasses imports while simultaneously strengthening enforcement mechanisms. The Act's true significance lay not in its specific provisions, but in its underlying principle: Parliament's right to tax colonial trade for revenue rather than regulation. This distinction, subtle but crucial, represented a fundamental shift in the constitutional relationship between Britain and her American colonies. Colonial merchants, particularly in New England, recognized the Sugar Act's implications immediately. The Act threatened to disrupt established trading patterns that had developed during decades of salutary neglect. When British officials had generally ignored colonial violations of trade regulations, the new emphasis on enforcement backed by expanded vice-admiralty courts and increased naval patrols transformed what had been theoretical legal obligations into practical economic burdens. The Stamp Act of 1765 carried these policies to their logical conclusion by requiring revenue stamps on newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, and other paper goods. The Act touched virtually every aspect of colonial life. More significantly, it established the precedent that Parliament could tax colonial internal commerce, not merely external trade. This constitutional innovation would prove far more inflammatory than British officials anticipated. Colonial resistance to the Stamp Act revealed the depth of American opposition to imperial fiscal policies. The Stamp Act Congress, meeting in New York in October 1765, brought together delegates from 9 colonies to coordinate resistance efforts. Their Declaration of Rights and Grievances articulated principles that would later find expression in the Declaration of Independence, particularly the argument that taxation without representation violated fundamental British constitutional principles. The military experience gained during the French and Indian War proved crucial in organizing colonial resistance. Veterans like Samuel Adams in Massachusetts and Patrick Henry in Virginia understood both the potential and limitations of organized opposition to imperial authority. Their experience with military logistics, coordination between different colonial forces, and resistance to professional military authority provided practical knowledge that would prove invaluable in the coming crisis. The morning of March 5th, 1770, dawned cold and gray over Boston Harbor, but the tension in the city's narrow streets burned hotter than any fire. British soldiers of the 29th Regiment of Foot stood guard outside the custom house, their scarlet uniforms, a stark reminder of imperial authority in a city seething with resentment. The presence of these troops, quartered in Boston since 1768 to enforce revenue collection, represented everything colonists had come to despise about post-war imperial policy. The quartering of British troops in colonial cities would have been unthinkable before the French and Indian War. Colonial assemblies had traditionally controlled military affairs within their borders, raising and disbanding forces as local conditions required. The permanent stationing of British regulars in American cities during peacetime represented a fundamental shift in imperial policy, one that many colonists interpreted as a direct threat to their traditional liberties. Captain Thomas Preston, commanding the British Guard that March evening, had served with distinction during the Siege of Havana in 1762. His soldiers, mostly Irish and Scottish recruits, had enlisted for adventure and steady pay, not for the impossible task of collecting taxes from hostile populations. The growing confrontation between British, colonial authority, and colonial resistance had placed these professional soldiers in an untenable position, required to enforce policies that many privately questioned while facing daily harassment from colonial crowds. The evening's events unfolded with tragic inevitability. A dispute between a British sentry and a colonial apprentice escalated into a larger confrontation as crowds gathered in King Street. Colonial protesters, including many veterans of the French and Indian War, understood military tactics and organization well enough to coordinate their harassment of British forces. Their experience with military discipline and command structures gained during the recent conflict enabled them to maintain cohesion despite the inflammatory nature of their protest. The shooting that followed, resulting in 5 colonial deaths, became known throughout America as the Boston Massacre. The victims, including Crispus Attucks, a man of mixed African and Native American ancestry, represented the diverse character of colonial society. Their deaths transformed abstract constitutional arguments about taxation and representation into immediate personal grievances that resonated throughout the colonies. John Adams, the future president who would defend the British soldiers in their subsequent trial, understood the broader implications of the confrontation. His legal defense of Captain Preston and his men was based on sound legal principles, but it also reflected his recognition that colonial resistance must remain within constitutional bounds to retain legitimacy. Adams had observed British military justice during the recent war and knew that disciplined legal proceedings would serve colonial interests better than mob violence. The trial itself revealed how thoroughly the French and Indian War had prepared colonists for political resistance. The lawyers, judges, and jury members had all lived through the recent conflict, experiencing British military authority firsthand. Their familiarity with military law, command structures, rules of engagement enabled them to evaluate the soldiers' actions with sophisticated understanding of military necessity and civilian rights. According to reports published in the Pennsylvania Journal, the Boston Massacre's political consequences extended far beyond Massachusetts. Colonial newspapers throughout America reported the incident in detail, using it to illustrate the dangers of standing armies in peacetime. The massacre became a powerful symbol of British tyranny, annually commemorated in speeches and publications that kept colonial grievances alive in public memory. The Tea Act of 1773 represented Parliament's final attempt to solve imperial fiscal problems through colonial revenue measures. By granting the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America, the act threatened to destroy colonial merchants' traditional trading relationships, while simultaneously asserting Parliament's right to regulate colonial commerce. The Act's provisions seemed designed to force a constitutional crisis rather than resolve ongoing disputes. Colonial resistance to the Tea Act drew heavily on organizational methods developed during the French and Indian War. The Sons of Liberty, active in every major colonial city, employed military-style coordination to organize boycotts and protests. Their leaders, many of whom had served as officers in provincial forces, understood the importance of unified command and coordinated action in confronting superior authority. The Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773, demonstrated the sophistication of colonial resistance organization. The carefully planned destruction of East India Company tea required precise timing, coordinated action, and disciplined execution. Participants disguised as Mohawk Indians were making a political statement about colonial identity and British authority. But their military precision reflected years of experience with organized resistance. The Intolerable Acts of 1774. Parliament's response to the Tea Party finally convinced many moderate colonists that peaceful resolution of imperial disputes was impossible. The acts closed Boston Harbor, revoked Massachusetts' charter, and expanded the Quartering Act to include all colonies. These measures seemed designed to provoke, rather than prevent, further colonial resistance, suggesting that British officials had abandoned hope of reconciliation. The delegates who gathered in Philadelphia's Carpenters Hall on September 1774 represented colonies that had been fundamentally transformed by 2 decades of imperial conflict. The First Continental Congress brought together men whose political education had been shaped by the French and Indian War and its aftermath, creating a uniquely American perspective on imperial relationships and constitutional authority. George Washington, now Virginia delegate, embodied this transformation. His experiences during the Braddock Expedition and subsequent campaigns had taught him both the potential and limitations of British military power. His service as a colonial officer had provided him with practical knowledge of military organization, logistics, and command that would prove invaluable in the coming crisis. More importantly, his wartime experiences had convinced him that American military capabilities, properly organized and led, could challenge even professional European forces. The Congress's proceedings revealed how thoroughly colonial attitudes had changed since the Treaty of Paris. Delegates who had once celebrated British victories now spoke of British tyranny with the same passion their fathers had reserved for French encroachment. The constitutional arguments they advanced, particularly regarding taxation and representation, reflected a sophisticated understanding of British legal traditions combined with a uniquely American interpretation of imperial relationships. Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, whose cousin John had defended the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, brought to the Congress a radical vision of American independence that would have been unthinkable before the recent imperial crisis. His organizational skills, honed during years of resistance activities, enabled him to coordinate colonial opposition with unprecedented effectiveness. Adams understood that successful resistance required not merely constitutional arguments, but practical organization and sustained commitment. The Congress's decision to impose a continental boycott of British goods represented a sophisticated economic strategy that reflected colonial commercial experience gained during the French and Indian War. Colonial merchants had learned to organize complex trading relationships, coordinate supply chains across vast distances, and maintain commercial discipline during extended campaigns. These skills proved readily adaptable to the requirements of economic warfare against imperial authority. The association established by the Congress created enforcement mechanisms that resembled military organization more than traditional political structures. Local committees of correspondence, many led by French and Indian War veterans, coordinated resistance activities with military precision. Their ability to maintain discipline and unity across 13 distinct colonies demonstrated organizational capabilities that British officials had consistently underestimated. The outbreak of fighting at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 marked the moment when constitutional arguments became armed rebellion. The colonial militia that confronted British regulars on that April morning included many veterans of the recent war, men who understood both the strengths and weaknesses of professional military forces. Their tactical knowledge gained during years of wilderness warfare enabled them to inflict significant casualties on British forces while avoiding decisive battle. Captain John Parker, commanding the Lexington militia, had served as a ranger during the French and Indian War, learning wilderness tactics that proved ideal for confronting British regulars. His famous instruction to his men, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here," reflected the disciplined approach to military confrontation that colonial officers had learned during the recent conflict. The fighting at Concord's North Bridge demonstrated how thoroughly colonial military thinking had evolved since the Braddock disaster. Instead of meeting British forces in formal battle, colonial militia employed the tactics of dispersal and concentration that had proved effective against French and Indian forces. Their ability to appear suddenly in overwhelming numbers, inflict casualties, and then disappear into familiar terrain confounded British tactical expectations. According to contemporary accounts published in the Virginia Gazette, the news of Lexington and Concord spread through the colonies with remarkable speed, carried by the same communication networks that had coordinated resistance to imperial policies. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Colonial assemblies authorized military preparations. Militia units began drilling. Delegates prepared for the Second Continental Congress that would transform colonial rebellion into American Revolution. The Second Continental Congress, convening in May 1775, faced the immediate necessity of organizing military resistance to British authority. The delegates' decision to appoint George Washington as commander-in-chief reflected their understanding that successful resistance required professional military leadership combined with uniquely American tactical approaches. Washington's appointment represented the culmination of a military education that had begun 20 years earlier in the Pennsylvania wilderness. The Continental Army that Washington inherited was composed largely of veterans of the French and Indian War, men who understood both the potential and limitations of citizen soldiers confronting professional military forces. Their experience with military organization, logistics, and tactical coordination provided the foundation for American military resistance. More importantly, their knowledge of wilderness warfare and unconventional tactics would prove crucial in the extended conflict that lay ahead. The Continental Army that assembled around Boston in the summer of 1775 represented the military culmination of 2 decades of colonial development. The soldiers who answered the call to arms brought with them not merely individual courage, but collective experience gained during the French and Indian War and its tumultuous aftermath. Their transformation from colonial subjects into American revolutionaries reflected a fundamental shift in political consciousness that the recent imperial crisis had accelerated but not created. General George Washington, assuming command of this diverse force, faced challenges that would have seemed impossible to the young militia officer who had survived the Braddock disaster 20 years earlier. The army he inherited was composed of men from different colonies with varying military traditions, equipment, and expectations. New England soldiers, accustomed to democratic decision-making and short-term service, confronted Virginian officers, who expected military hierarchy and extended campaigns. The successful fusion of these different military cultures would require all the diplomatic and organizational skills Washington had developed during his colonial service. The Siege of Boston provided the new Continental Army with its first extended test of organization and discipline. The tactical situation, with American forces surrounding a British garrison, reversed the normal pattern of colonial warfare. Instead of defending scattered settlements against mobile enemies, American forces now conducted a formal siege against professional European troops. This experience provided invaluable education in military engineering, artillery placement, and coordinated logistics that would prove crucial in later campaigns. The successful capture of Fort Ticonderoga by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold in May 1775 demonstrated how colonial military experience could be adapted to revolutionary purposes. Both men had served during the French and Indian War, learning wilderness tactics and siege warfare that they now employed against their former allies. The forts captured cannons, transported to Boston by Henry Knox in an epic winter journey, provided the artillery that would eventually force British evacuation of the city. The British evacuation of Boston in March 1776 marked a psychological turning point in the revolutionary conflict. Colonial forces had successfully expelled professional British troops from a major city, demonstrating that American military capabilities could challenge imperial authority. The victory's significance extended beyond its immediate tactical consequences, proving to both Americans and Europeans that colonial resistance possessed the organizational capacity and military skill necessary for sustained warfare. The Declaration of Independence, approved by the Continental Congress in July 1776, represented the intellectual culmination of the colonial experience since the French and Indian War. The document's famous assertion that all men are created equal reflected political principles that had been developing throughout the imperial crisis. Its catalog of grievances against King George III included many complaints that originated in post-war imperial policies, particularly regarding taxation, military occupation, and territorial expansion. Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration's primary author, had witnessed the imperial transformation of Virginia society during his youth. His political education included observation of the colonial assembly's struggles with royal governors, the economic disruption caused by imperial revenue measures, and the social tensions created by British military occupation. These experiences informed his understanding of both the practical grievances that motivated colonial resistance and the philosophical principles that justified American independence. The military campaigns that followed independence revealed how thoroughly the French and Indian War had prepared Americans for revolutionary warfare. The tactical flexibility that colonial forces had learned during wilderness campaigns proved ideal for confronting British regulars in a variety of terrain and circumstances. American commanders like Daniel Morgan, who had served as a ranger during the earlier conflict, employed unconventional tactics that consistently frustrated British expectations. The war's conclusion with the Treaty of Paris in 1783 brought American independence, but it also completed the transformation that had begun with the French and Indian War. The United States that emerged from the Revolutionary War was populated by citizens who had experienced both the benefits and costs of imperial membership. Their political institutions reflected this experience, incorporating safeguards against arbitrary authority while maintaining the organizational capacity necessary for effective government. The Constitution drafted in Philadelphia in 1787 represented the institutional culmination of the American colonial experience. The document's provisions regarding military affairs, taxation, and federal authority reflected lessons learned during both the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War. The framers' understanding of the balance between effective government and individual liberty had been shaped by their observation of imperial policies and their consequences. The French and Indian War had indeed set the stage for the American Revolution, but not in the way contemporary observers might have predicted. Instead of creating loyal British subjects grateful for imperial protection, the conflict had produced experienced military leaders, sophisticated political thinkers, and organized resistance networks that would prove capable of successful rebellion. The wilderness campaigns that had once secured the British Empire in North America had ultimately created the conditions that would destroy it, transforming 13 disparate colonies into a unified nation capable of independence and self-government. The young George Washington, who had emerged from the Pennsylvania forests in 55 could never have imagined that his colonial military service would prepare him for the presidency of an independent republic. Yet the connection between these experiences was direct and profound, demonstrating how the French and Indian War had created not merely the conditions for American independence, but the leadership and institutions necessary for its success.